I'd like to echo again all the comments of the previous speakers saying what a wonderful series of talks this is and how I think incredibly privileged we all feel to be here. I've actually slightly changed my title from the program. It now has the phrase in front of it, macro matters, because I want to talk about macro cultural evolution and why that really matters. What am I going to do? I'm going to talk about how big, or at least big-ish data, is coming to the field of cultural evolution and what that affords in terms of possibilities of evolutionary analyses of the drivers of cultural diversity. I want to talk about how, given that big data, ideas and methods from evolutionary biology can be used to analyze cultural macroevolution. And then I want to talk about some of the criticisms that are often raised of that kind of approach, that in extending these evolutionary ideas and methods to culture, there's a risk of overextension, of getting carried away with metaphor. And finally, I want to finish with a plea for why we should never forget about cultural macroevolution. Okay, a quick history, really, of what's just happened in biology, in evolutionary biology, in the last 20 years. Evolutionary biology has been kind of utterly transformed by a deluge of data. First of all, DNA sequences, and increasingly now whole genomes. There's been an exponential explosion of data and of databases in which to store the masses of that kind of data. And as a consequence of that, there's also been an explosion of methods that have been used to kind of analyze that data. And so, in thinking about cultural evolution, the question is the same kind of thing be extended to culture? Are we seeing or about to see an explosion of cultural databases? Is big data coming to the field of cultural evolution? And the answer is, well, not quite, but bigger data sets are increasingly becoming available. There's global databases of lexical data, there's global databases of phonology, and there's language family kind of specific databases. And one of the things that my department in Yale is doing is trying to put a lot of these things together and under the kind of label of kind of glottobank, a kind of linguistic equivalent of GenBank, and create a series of linked databases for language diversity that are really kind of global and that will facilitate kind of large-scale comparative evolutionary informed analyses of language diversity. But it's not that really that I want to talk about today, but instead about a cultural database, the dplace database, and the kind of large-scale comparative analyses that can be done given that kind of database. Now, the dplace project was initially a NESCENT-funded project that brought together a working group of people from all over the world. I don't quite have time to kind of cover them, but it was a consortium trying to bring together a variety of cultural data sets to link those cultural sets to fine-grained environmental data and to geographic and linguistic information. So this data set, this database is now publicly accessible. If you go to www.dplace.org, you can play along. So if you're getting a bit bored during the talk, go and have a look and see what's on dplace. What you'll find is a database from approximately 1,400 cultures with a range of different cultural variables that are coded in a standardized way. And what I want to emphasize is that this database is continuing to evolve. So fairly soon, we'll also incorporate what's called the standard cross-cultural sample into this database. And one of the really important things about these databases is that it's not a standalone enterprise. It's linked out to other sources of cultural and linguistic information. But if you're an evolutionist, you want to know more than just about the cultural variation. You want to know about the context in which that occurs and about its history and about its geography. So what we did in this database project was to include a whole lot of environmental variables so we could do essentially kind of ecological analyses of cultural diversity. So this database contains information about rainfall, about temperature, about annual productivity, about the number of animal and plant species, and also various other geographic features. If you look at this database, you'll see that you can plot features on the map. So if you happen to be interested, say, in kind of class distinctions, you can see 3 different kinds of class distinctions plotted here around the world. The absence of class distinctions, a wealth distinction, which is inherited, and wealth distinctions that are inherited and are very resistant to kind of change. So one way you can represent this data is visually on a map. Another way is via trees. So thinking in an evolutionary way, what we've done is linked the cultural data to a broad set of language phylogenies so that we can facilitate the phylogenetic analysis of this cultural diversity. Now, just an example of what can be done when you assemble this kind of data, I want to talk about one particular project. The dPlace team consisted of some linguists, some geographers, and some ecologists. And the ecologists were one day talking about how in birds and in mammals, typically you see much higher levels of sociality in kind of harsh environments. And so we started speculating about whether you might see the same kind of ecological structuring of variation in humans. So what about us? Well, we thought, well, we can have a look using this dPlace database. So what we did was to plot on a map the annual environmental productivity. And that's shown in kind of grey here. So basically the greyer areas are kind of more productive and the lighter areas have less environmental productivity. And the people that I've been working with, such as Carlos Patero, had been plotting the distribution of cooperative birds onto this kind of map. What we did was to plot the distribution of beliefs in a moralizing high God. So a moralizing God is one that intervenes in kind of human affairs, and a high God is a God who either created the universe or created the other gods and is more kind of powerful than those gods. And what Carlos noticed was that this distribution of belief in moralizing high gods looked remarkably like the kind of distribution that he'd seen for the belief in kind of, not for the belief, for sociality in kind of birds. So we set about testing the notion that maybe there's ecological constraints on our notions of God. So what we did was to first take this large number of ecological variables and deal with the problem that they're all intercorrelated, the horror of intercollinearity in the kind of data. And we boiled them down to 2 major principal components. One, which was about environmental productivity or abundance, and another one was a measure of environmental predictability. So those became our 2 major environmental features. And then we looked in the literature about a number of predictors that people had claimed might influence the belief in a moralizing high God. And you might think that these beliefs tend to be inherited down cultural lineages. You might think that they tend to diffuse kind of geographically. You might think that in very hierarchical societies, there's more likely to believe in a moralizing high God. It had been also claimed that agricultural societies or societies with animal husbandry were more likely to believe in high gods. And typically in the past, what had been done is that these factors had been tested in a single kind of way. What we did was to use a generalized linear model mixed approach to see about the impact of all these variables together, to see what combination of variables would let us predict the presence or absence of belief in a moralizing high God in our species. So first, just look singularly at the idea that the environment might influence beliefs in the presence of a moralizing high God. So what you can see here is the measure of resource abundance, and basically when life is hard, there's a much higher probability of belief in a moralizing high God. Similarly, when life is really uncertain, there's a much higher belief in a presence of a moralizing high God. But there was an interesting interaction. If things are really bad, and it's really certain that they'll be bad, you also get a kind of interactive effect. That's when you have the kind of highest beliefs in the presence of a moralizing high God. So we're able to show that there are these ecological constraints on our kind of cultural beliefs and values, beliefs in a moralizing high God. But that was just one factor of many. Here you can see a range of the different models we fitted using this approach and their Ikaiki kind of weights. And you can see that the best fitting group of models include spatial proximity, political complexity, animal husbandry and abundance, and also this sort of interaction with environmental stability and stability in abundance. And when we average over those models, we can see how well we can predict the presence or absence of a belief in a moralizing high God. And you might say, Russell, you know, human history is so complicated. Human culture is so complicated. The idea that with a few simple variables you'd be able to, you know, predict something as complex and as contingent as belief in a moralizing high God, you know, it's not going to go very well. Well, what we did was to estimate these kind of model parameters on a proportion of the data, on 2/3 of the data, and then look at our ability to predict the final third, which we held separate. And I kind of thought, what would be a passing grade? Well, what we got was 91%. Now, I don't know, at the University of Auckland, that's an A+. So what I'm emphasizing here is that by extending kind of biological ideas to culture, to things that we think are often incredibly unique and incredibly contingent and incredibly complex, actually we can predict in principled ways remarkably well something as apparently complex as a belief in a moralizing high God. So, biggish data is kind of coming, and will afford increasingly these kind of broad-scale comparative analyses where we can control for kind of language family dependencies, where we can control and investigate the impacts of kind of spatial diffusion, and test these very broad-scale hypotheses. So what I want to do in the second part of this talk is emphasize that we should not just be extending evolutionary methods and ecological methods to analysing cultural variation. We should also be extending evolutionary kind of thinking. And one of my all-time favourite evolutionary books was this book on the major transitions in evolution by John Maynard Smith and Ernst Sackler. And in this wonderful book, what they do is take a very broad-scale look at what have been the big transitions in evolution. And they kind of start off with the evolution of replicating molecules, and then of chromosomes, and then of DNA, and then of eukaryotes, and then of sex, and then of multicellularity, eusociality, and finally, the evolution of language and culture. And that was a really interesting kind of classification, I think, of the major transitions. But even more fascinating was that they claimed that there were 5 underlying general principles in these major transitions. That in each of them, smaller entities join to form bigger entities, and that once you have this bigger entity, that you then get some differentiation of roles within that bigger entity, that the smaller entity's reproduction then becomes dependent upon the bigger entity, but you'll also get conflicts between these different elements. And finally, that within that new differentiated entity, there will arise new ways of transmitting information. Now, you can perhaps guess where I'm going. I think that's a really interesting framework, not just to think about biological evolution, but also to extend it and to think about cultural evolution. Because in cultural evolution, we do see major transitions where small entities aggregate to form bigger ones, where we get differentiations of roles, where we get kind of joint kind of dependencies, where we get conflicts between reds and blues, and also where you get new ways of transmitting information, not just language, but perhaps things like the internet. I want to look at one major transition that there's lots of current discussion about from both evolutionists and kind of social theorists. And this is the question about how humans were able to go from small-scale, relatively egalitarian societies to the large, highly stratified, highly unequal societies that most of us live in today. That's a kind of major transition. It involves lots of those things that Maynard Smith and Murray talked about, units coming together, differentiation of roles, and some conflict. Now, many kind of theorists have emphasized that one way in which you might produce cohesion in these larger kind of units, one of the main things that might have driven the evolution of large-scale complex societies is beliefs in moralizing high gods. Moralizing high gods can be watching you in a way that a chief can't. They can always be watching you. They can virtually enforce kind of social norms by punishing you in the afterlife, and they can outsource the costs of punishment. No individual actually has to pay the kind of costs of punishment. And I think this is a really interesting and kind of plausible argument. Actually, this isn't actually a moralizing high god, just a fearsome-looking Hawaiian god. It's Ku, the Hawaiian god of war, but Ku was just one of many gods. To be a bit more specific, what I want to emphasize is that it's been claimed that moralizing high gods play a causal role in the history of the evolution, the cultural evolution of large-scale societies. And just to show one kind of quote from Sharif, Noorenzire, and Henrik in 2009, they say, "It's no coincidence that the world is now dominated by a few great monotheisms, and that much of human behavior is influenced by the belief in a few high gods. To achieve a civilization of the scale, it was necessary to invent them." So the claim is not just one of correlation, it's a causal one, that we needed to create the notion of a high god in order to have the evolution of large-scale societies. And there was a recent article, or series of articles in Science that depicts this kind of view rather well. You can see here in small-scale societies, these small-scale societies worship small gods. They worship ancestral spirits, they worship the god of the tree, the fire, and the stone. But these gods, individually at least, are not powerful enough to enforce social norms to produce large-scale societies. And they contrast that with what they claim is the ethnographic picture, where large-scale societies, here an Aztec society, worshipping a big god, a moralizing high god. And that view was captured very nicely in Arazian's book, Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation in Conflict. Now, in that book, Ara very nicely summarizes of a range of experimental evidence that seems to support the notion that cooperation is enhanced by various kinds of religious primes. So that's the laboratory evidence. The question is, did that really happen when we look across cultures? And on the face of it, the answer is yes. Yes, there is a correlation between societies that are more politically complex and those that have moralizing high gods. Dominic Johnson published this paper in 2005 where he took data from the Santa Cruz cultural sample and showed that there was this correlation. But as evolutionists, we should be perhaps a little bit more skeptical in that. And it's known that even in the standard cross-cultural sample, where there's an attempt to sample cultures that are not geographically close and that are not kind of likely to be closely related, there is still some phylogenetic dependence. This problem that the cultures are not statistically independent is famously known as Galton's problem. It was noted way back on the 13th of November in 1888. Edward Tyler was giving a kind of remarkably learned discourse on postmarital residence patterns and how to avoid your in-laws from a comparative cultural analysis. And as often the case, some annoying person at the back of the room raised their hands and came up with a rather telling objection. Galton said to Tyler that full information should be given as to the degree in which the customs of the tribes and the races which are being compared together are independent. Might it be that some of the tribes had been derived from a common source, so that they were duplicate copies of the same original? So that's famously become known as Galton's problem, but it's a problem that evolutionists have solved, because you can have explicit phylogenetic methods that enable us to model trait evolution on phylogenetic trees that gets around the non-independence of both biological species and cultures. So what I want to talk about is some work we did using an explicit phylogenetic approach to try and test this claim, this causal claim, that belief in a moralizing high God led to the evolution of politically complex societies. I'm going to focus in on one particular region of the world, and it's the region of the world, Ireland, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, a region that was populated by the expansion of Austronesian languages and cultures. Now, these are lovely photos of kind of small atolls, but lots of the parts of the world that were covered by the Austronesian expansion don't look like these small atolls. The Austronesian cultures range from kind of large cultures that currently have like 22 million people in them to down to those that just have 20-odd, say, current kind of speakers. And they cover a kind of vast geographic range, and they also have a big range in political complexity and a big range of religious beliefs and practices. So in many ways, the kind of Austronesian kind of set of cultures is really a perfect laboratory for investigating cultural evolution. You have a single linguistic and cultural expansion that's played out across a stage of lots of different ecologies, producing a diversity of products. And it's one for which we have explicit phylogenetic trees for the languages spoken in these regions, and trees that we've been able to date by calibrating various and constraining various nodes and then estimating the other branches. And you can see that the trees for the languages, these Austronesian languages, trace back to Taiwan a bit over 5,000 years ago. They show a long pause before the settlement of the Philippines, then a rapid expansion pulse out 7,000 kilometers into into parts of Polynesia, then another long pause before the settlements of the most remote parts of Polynesia. And what I want to really emphasize is, because people are perhaps, I think quite rightly, wonder, well, do these language trees really capture an important part of the population history, is that at least in this case, they really do. And that's why the Austronesian expansion is such an ideal test case for cultural evolution. These trees fit remarkably well with evidence from archaeology that again suggests an origin in Taiwan, a long pause before the settlement of the Philippines, a rapid expansion pulse, followed again by another long pause. So the linguistic signal is mirrored by the archaeology and increasingly by analysis of genome kind of wide samples. So we can use these language trees as proxies for kind of population history and analyze cultural evolution on them. To do that, we needed a database of beliefs and practices across this range of Austronesian cultures. And Quentin Atkinson and I were lucky enough to have a fantastic PhD student, Joseph Watts, who assembled a team of dedicated coders who poured through whole lots of ethnographies for these cultures and can independently coded up religious beliefs and practices across Austronesian cultures. And you can look at this database. The data's available online. It's called Paloto, and Paloto means abode of the gods in Samoan. Culture's complex. You need to have kind of clear kind of coding decisions. What we did was to discriminate between two kinds of moralizing supernatural agents. There were some supernatural agents that would be punishing in that they would reliably monitor and punish kind of selfish actions, ones that went against kind of social norms. That's broad-scale moralizing agents. And the small gods could do that, the gods of the stream, the stones, the sky. And we differentiated those from moralizing high gods, which were moralizing agents that governed or created the cosmos, that set it into place, and that actively intervened in kind of human affairs. And finally, we binarized political complexity into societies that had low political complexity. They were either acephalous, egalitarian societies, and we combined those with societies where there were simple chieftains, and we separated out societies where there were high levels of political complexity. Societies not where there were chiefs, but paramount chiefs or state-like level organization. And what we could then do is use these computational phylogenetic methods to test the hypothesis that belief in a moralizing high god would be correlated with the evolution of politically complex societies, and it would actually play a kind of causal role in the evolution of politically complex societies. So what you can see here is the language tree where presence of broad-scale moralizing agents is shown in yellow across the 90-odd cultures that we analysed. And here is the same tree, but we've mapped onto it these societies with as high levels of political complexity. And you could just do some kind of simple chi-square, but that would be cheating because we know that these societies are actually related by descent. So what we use is Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo phylogenetic methods to test whether there's a correlation, a dependency between the evolution of moralizing societies or societies with moralizing agents and those with high-level political complexity. And we find that, yes, there is a significant coupling. But more powerfully, what these methods can do is enable us to test kind of causal hypotheses about human history. We can estimate the transition rates, or the transition probabilities, if you like, between the different states. So these figures look a bit complex, but imagine the ancestral state was no moralizing agent and not politically complex societies. Now, it looks like you can't, very unlikely that you jump straight to politically complex societies. Much more likely if you start either here or here, that first you get moralizing, and then that increases the probability of getting the evolution of politically complex societies. And when we do the model comparison approach, we can see that there's much stronger support for this transition than there is for this transition. So in that way, we can test the kind of causal claim. And yes, broad-scale moralizing seems to be involved in the evolution of political complexity. But that's not what the claims have been about. It's not what most of the claims have been about. Most of the claims have been about that you don't just need some kind of moralizing agent or set of moralizing agents. You really need these big gods because they are kind of much more widely present. They can coordinate and monitor things on a much kind of broader scale. So what happens when we look not at moralizing agents, but moralizing high gods? And I want to emphasize that we went back to the original ethnographies and really tried to root out all cases of borrowed in kind of notions of God, or the moralizing gods, and looked at, and there's actually just a few cases, 6, dotted across the Austronesian cultures, where it seemed like you might have had something like an indigenous moralizing high god. And 3 of those were also politically complex societies. But because those were independent events, we actually found moderate support for correlated evolution. But that isn't the claim, not just there's some correlation, it's a claim about the causal ordering. If you have a big god, then you're more likely to have a big society. And that is exactly not what we found. If the ancestral state was to not have a big god, and not have a politically complex society, you can see that there's very low probability that first you get a big god and then you get a big society. That actually what looks more likely is that first societies get big and then they get a big god. So there's a correlation but not a causal relationship. And when we looked at detail at the ethnographies of those societies with big gods, what we saw was that although the name for that god was one that was clearly an indigenous name, it was highly likely that the notion of a god, of a big god, had been borrowed in from contact with Muslim traders. So the notion, the idea of a big god, had actually diffused. And I think this is an interesting case of where you can use these kind of tree-based methods to infer kind of cultural diffusion. And what seems likely is that the Muslim traders were much more likely to trade with large-scale organized societies because they had more resources, could be more organized for trade, and that's why we get that apparent correlation. So I think quite clear evidence that at least in the Austronesian case, this very plausible claim about a sort of driver of a major transition in human cultural evolution is just false. And that prompted us to think a little bit more about what might actually be happening. Look again at this picture, this lovely picture from science. Is that really what was happening in these Aztec kind of rituals? It looks, there's the kind of huge chief. There's a couple of guards. It looks like some giant kind of outdoor aerobics or Tai Chi kind of exercise. And just a couple of guards for that kind of vast crowd. Well, again, we looked at the kind of ethnographic record, and far from being this kind of great kind of outdoor love fest, it was rather more like this, that the Aztec rituals were marked by kind of an incredible amount of basically ritual human sacrifice. You can see hearts being pulled out, bodies tossed publicly down the stairs. And when we looked more widely around the world, this didn't seem to be a kind of one-off case. That in almost every case we have had the development of a large-scale society, at least briefly, there's been large amounts of a ritual human sacrifice. If you look in Austronesia, say for example in Hawaii, which by the time of European settlement was getting up to being a proto-state, here you can see some poor chap being punished for some social transgression. You can see the chief ordering the execution, two people who are possibly priests kind of holding them down, and this fairly fearsome warrior about to pummel the poor chap to death. And ritual human sacrifice was actually very widespread across Austronesian societies. The victim was typically of low social status, had transgressed some kind of social norm, and the instigator was typically of high status. And this suggests an alternative kind of hypothesis. Rather than the role of religion, and particularly moralizing high gods, being all about promoting pro-sociality broadly, might not religious practices, at least such as ritual human sacrifice, be much more about preserving the social control of elites? And so we thought, again, about how we might investigate that. Just for those that are interested, lots of occasions for ritual human sacrifice across Austronesia, breaching a taboo, the funeral of an important chief, or the consecration of a newly built house or canoe. And I won't go into the various kind of rather gruesome methods. Instead, I'll show you the results. And once again, we're using these computational phylogenetic methods to test not just for the correlation of these traits, but whether ritual human sacrifice plays a causal role. In this case, we're going to look not at levels of political complexity, but levels of social inequality. So here you can see what we did was to divide social inequality, at least in this analysis, up into two groups. Societies where there was no hereditary differences in wealth, and we coupled those with societies that there were hereditary differences in wealth, and we compared those with ones where hereditary differences in wealth were very resistant to kind of change. So we binarized this kind of variable, at least for this analysis. And you can see the distribution of ritual human sacrifice, quite widespread across these Austronesian cultures, and you can see in purple the cases of entrenched social inequality. Because one of the things about large-scale societies is not just that they're large scale, but you get the entrenchment of social inequality. And if you look at these transition rates here, you can see that if we compare, say, this rate with that rate, societies that had ritual human sacrifice were much more likely to become have entrenched kind of social inequality. So the grim and rather dark picture this shows is that ritual human sacrifice, and pleasant as it is, at least in the case of the evolution of Austronesian cultures, played a causal role in driving the evolution of social inequality. How am I going for time? Right, okay. So what I've been trying to show so far is that the availability of these large comparative databases, particularly when they're linked to environmental data and information about linguistic history, enables us to test kind of evolutionary hypotheses about some of the major drivers of major transitions in human social organization. But there are those who are rather skeptical, in fact, extremely skeptical of this whole approach. The famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould was one of them. Gould said, human cultural evolution proceeds along paths outstandingly different from the ways of genetic change. Biological evolution is constantly diverging. Once lineages separate, they cannot amalgamate, a process that occurs very rarely in animals. Trees are the correct topologies of biological evolution. In human evolution, on the other hand, transmission and anastomosis are rampant. Well, that was kind of Gould's very strong kind of claim. That claim has kind of been echoed more recently by Noren Zier and kind of Joe Henrich, and where they say, we caution, nevertheless we caution against rushing to embrace analytical techniques imported from genetic evolution and used to construct species phylogenies to cultural evolution. Cultural evolution is in some crucial respects unlike genetic evolution. Species, for example, are not subject to intergroup competition that creates massive and directed horizontal transmission of only some traits. Now, I think it's interesting to kind of step back and say, what's really the kind of claim here? And I think these authors could be making a series of linked, but perhaps logically distinct claims about what's wrong with applying this kind of phylogenetic tree-based view to kind of culture. First, they could be claiming, as Gould appeared to be, that cultural evolution is just very, very far from kind of tree-like, and therefore very, very different from biology. But I'd have to say, like if Gould was here, I'd say, mate, what biology have you been studying? Because we know that the kind of tree of life is very, very far from a kind of tree of life. That particularly in the kind of deeper branches, there's been huge amounts of kind of lateral gene transfer and kind of symbiosis. But even in plants and animals, the estimates are that there's about 10% hybridization in animals and about 25% in plants. And certainly for kind of prokaryotes, estimates, say from Dargan and Martin, suggest that about 2/3 of the gene families have undergone some kind of horizontal transmission. And yet, despite the fact that biological genetic evolution in many ways is very non-tree-like, trees are enormously useful in kind of analyzing genetic evolution. So I think that first argument is just too fast and just too crude, and the disanalogy is far too overdrawn. A more subtle way of putting that argument would be that cultures are not like vertebrate species, where the different kind of gene lineages are relatively all tied together. So there's a kind of slogan in genetics that every gene has its own history. It echoes a kind of famous slogan from dialectology where dialectologists say that every word has its own history. And I think both those things are true, but the question is an empirical one about the extent to which these different gene genealogies kind of cohere or not. So again, this is not a knockdown argument against cultural phylogenetics, just as it's not a knockdown argument against applying phylogenies to genetics. It's an empirical question about the extent of congruence between different kinds of lineages. And you actually need to build trees in order to investigate the amount of coherence of the kind of history. So if anything, this should be an argument for doing more kind of cultural phylogenetics to investigate the coherence of cultural kind of lineages. A third argument they might be making is that in building those trees, our estimates are likely to be biased by, say, undetected kind of borrowing. And again, that's something we can investigate empirically or via simulation, and kind of actually we have. This is some work that Tom Curry and Simon Greenhill and I did. We simulated two kinds of evolutionary trees, a chained one and a balanced tree topology, and three different kind of borrowing scenarios. One where there's borrowing between languages that had diverged within 1,000 years, within 3,000 years, and randomly across the tree. And we simulated different levels of undetected borrowing. And we looked at the impact on how far it would perturb our estimates of the trees from the kind of known kind of tree. And the kind of basic answer here is that you need very high levels of borrowing in order to substantially perturb the kind of estimates of the kind of genealogical history. Now, if you care, like most linguists do, about every single branch, then you're not going to be totally kind of happy with that. But if you want to make kind of robust inferences that maybe you integrate over a range of uncertainty about the history, what these simulation results seem to show is that those inferences are likely to be robust. Finally, I think Joe Henrich and colleagues claim that these methods kind of haven't been kind of validated against kind of known history. And my simple answer to that would be the kind of Austronesian phylogeny that I showed, where the tree built from kind of basic vocabulary gets a remarkable fit from what we know about archaeology and increasingly kind of genetics. And to precisely being able to predict which branches will be really long and which branches will be really short, showing rapid expansion pulses. So if that's not validation, I don't know what is. To conclude, this whole talk really is a kind of plea for when we think about extending biological ideas and methods to culture, that we absolutely shouldn't forget about cultural macroevolution. There's lots of wonderful stuff being done on kind of modeling transition trains and so forth. I think it's all good, but we need to be like evolutionary biologists. We need to connect up microevolution to macroevolution. And what I want to emphasize is in biology, if you look at the kind of main kind of textbooks on biological evolution, about a third or a quarter of the content of these textbooks will be about macroevolution. If you look at a lot of debates about cultural evolution at the moment, to me, they're obsessing on relatively minor microevolutionary questions. So I want to finish with a plea for not forgetting about cultural macroevolution. Thanks to you, thanks to the organisers, thanks to all my colleagues that I've had the pleasure of working with, and to the funders that have provided financial support for this work. Thank you.